Hello, History 72B Spring Quarter 2023. This is our last lecture in Package D, from the War to End All Wars to the Great Depression. We will look at World War I and the 1920s here, and then pick up with the Great Depression and the New Deal in the next package. The U.S. entered World War I in 1917, and the war officially ended in 1918, so the U.S. was not involved for a particularly long time. But the U.S. did send troops, and even more important to us, it had already amped up production of war supplies to support allies, especially Great Britain. The increase in jobs that came with increased production, combined with the decrease in workers as men were drafted, meant job openings for those who could not be drafted. It's not so much that women entered the workforce. We know about a quarter of women over 16 were already there. Rather, women were able to move into higher paying jobs. The percentage of women working did increase to close to half, with a greater increase among married women. Black people, men and women, also sought better paying industrial work. Like white women, they often got lower pay than white men, but the pay was better than sharecropping in the South. Starting in 1916, the number of Black people migrating jumped, with at least 450,000 people leaving the South and going to urban industrial areas, especially St. Louis, Chicago, New York, and Detroit. This is referred to as the Great Migration or First Great Migration. Black people faced violence in both the North and the South. White people who owned the means of production, whether agricultural land or industrial factories, wanted their labor, but none offered them protection. In the South, white people in power actually tried to stop Black people from leaving. The image here is by artist Jacob Lawrence, who did an entire series on the Great Migration, which is well worth looking up. Black people were generally faced with segregation in the North, but they also became the targets of white resentment from both the middle and the working classes. The earliest major attack by white mobs came in 1917 in East St. Louis. The mob targeted especially middle-class Black neighborhoods, burning them and killing at least 40 Black people. You will see these rampages called race riots even now in history books. This makes the white people doing the rioting invisible and makes it sound like it was a both sides thing when it decidedly was not. The term white rampage is mine, but it is closer to the truth of what happened. The worst rampages came during the summer of 1919, called the Red Summer. White mobs attacked Black neighborhoods in more than 36 U.S. cities. The most famous was a 13-day rampage in Chicago that completely destroyed entire Black neighborhoods, burning them to the ground. These years also saw an uptick in lynchings, with at least 382 Black people murdered between 1914 and 1920. Mexican immigration also increased in this time period. Fleeing the Mexican Revolution and looking for wartime work in the U.S., somewhere around 100,000 Mexican people immigrated to the U.S., mostly settling in segregated neighborhoods in the West. While Mexican Americans faced racism, they were not met with the wholesale violence meted out to Black Americans. Violence continued into the next decade. The 1920s are often presented as the Roaring Twenties, as the economy rode the wave of post-World War I production and supply, including for a war-destroyed Europe. People tend to think of flappers and the Charleston dance, prohibition and speakeasies, and all of these things existed, but they are only a bit of the story. As scholar A.B. Krista Schwartz has noted, the image of joyful abandon, experimentation, and a relaxation of Victorian morality, however, reflects only one side of an era, equally shaped by racism, epitomized by a regrouping of the Ku Klux Klan, and fears about developments in the field of sexuality and gender, particularly the changing role of women and the more open discussion of topics related to sexuality. Anti-vice movements like the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice and the Committee of 14, founded by members of the Anti-Saloon League, flourished. Policing of less wealthy neighborhoods increased, largely aimed at arresting sex workers, both female and male. And while the image of the 1920s is glitzy, income inequality was high, much like the Gilded Age of the 1890s or now. That's the story heading into the 1920s, but it is a very superficial overview, so here we will shift gears a bit. While Black people experienced incredible violence, there was so much more to their lives. In fact, they were creating revolutions in the arts and literature that would influence the entire world. While this was the work of many independent artists, the period is often given a single name, like the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance did not spring out of nothing, but was built on work done by earlier Black educators, students, and intellectuals. Dozens of African American colleges and universities, what we now call HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities, were founded in the years following the Civil War, and Black writers, professors, and students like W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson had already begun to create critical material recognized across the U.S. and beyond. While developments in the arts, especially music and dance, occurred in all cities that Black people lived in, the name Harlem Renaissance comes from one particularly important center. Harlem in New York developed into a predominantly Black urban district during the Great Migration. New York attracted many migrants who, because of racial segregation, ended up clustered in the formerly white neighborhood of Harlem. This close proximity fostered conversations and interactions, and in turn, drew more and more Black creatives to Harlem. In the words of writer, philosopher, and central figure in the Harlem Renaissance, Alain Locke, Harlem brought to it the African, the West Indian, the Negro American, the Negro of the North and the Negro of the South, the man from the city and the man from the town and village, the peasant, the student, the businessman, the professional man, artist, poet, musician, adventurer, and worker, preacher and criminal, exploiter, and social outcast. Locke was a scholar of the highest order and attended Harvard, Oxford, and the University of Berlin. The only thing I would add to his words is that Harlem did not only attract men. Prominent among the women, and a scholar like Locke, was Zora Neale Hurston. Hurston, an anthropologist and folklorist, studied at Columbia University. She performed music based on her folkloric research and made recordings along with her notes and manuscripts. Hurston also used the music and stories that she collected to inform her critically acclaimed literature and plays, including Mules and Men, a collection of Black American folklore, and the novel Their Eyes Were Watching God, which often makes it into lists of books that white people want to ban. Poet, playwright, novelist, and innovator in jazz poetry, Langston Hughes was another leader in the literary dimension of the Harlem Renaissance. You have poetry by Langston Hughes to read for this package under popular culture. I urge you to read those if you have not done so already. I've included the shorter one of his that I've given you on the slide. I, too, sing American. I am the darker brother they send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. Harlem was also the home to innovative music and dance, and it was accepting of both the marginalized and the mainstream. White bourgeois visitors discovered what they considered to be exotic and primitive, read not sexually inhibited, entertainment and clubs in Harlem. Because of economic disparity, 95% of high-end Harlem nightclubs and speakeasies were owned by whites, who pushed their Black entertainers to modify their work to white tastes. Anti-vice squads that raided white areas were far more tolerant in Harlem and especially likely to overlook vice in clubs owned by whites and catering to wealthy and middle-class white clients. Thus, both geographically and intellectually, Harlem nightlife was distant enough that white Americans didn't feel immediately threatened, but close enough that white audiences felt that they were experiencing entertainment forbidden closer to home. Behind this screen, Harlem's intellectual, artistic, and social life flourished, with the input of those marginalized in white mainstream America of standard history books. Schwartz notes that Renaissance leader Alain Locke, a self-identified gay man who displayed a keen interest in sexology, was consulted by various young men regarding sexual, of course that should only have one S, regarding sexual problems, many of them related to same-sex desire. Locke ran what would have been identified as a literary and artistic salon in Enlightenment Europe 200 years prior. These were meeting places in which intellectual brilliance was inextricable from social and sexual interactions. County Collin, you have a little glimpse of his poetry and letters for this modular package, frequented Locke's salon, as did Langston Hughes. Locke fostered a type of male homosexuality also emerging in Europe, which interpreted male same-sex attraction as the ultimate in masculinity and a place for intellectual mentoring relationships. New York in the late 19th century had supported a system of same-sex activities that did not fit what we might classify as homosexuality now. People were identified first by the gender they performed, not by whom they had intercourse with. Where intercourse did factor in, the issue was one of who penetrated whom. Thus, so-called fairies who performed an effeminate role were considered perverts, but men like sailors who hired sex workers, male or female, were categorized as just ordinary men, or in fact quite manly men. By the 1920s, this system had begun to break down in New York at large, but still held in large parts of Harlem. The culture of Harlem went far deeper than accepting the white bourgeoisie, who wanted to feel the excitement of what they considered slumming, and that was the word of the time. Cross-class and cross-race relationships were tolerated in a way only possible outside of middle and upper-class white urban areas. Harlem was far enough removed that white men and women could form personal connections without these necessarily having ramifications in their daily lives among neighbors and co-workers. Some of these relationships were purely financial. Black sex workers catered to a white crowd, and white sex workers to the Black crowd. But Harlem also opened the door to sincere and committed relationships, those, Black and white, who were figuring out where they existed in the network of sex and sexuality, had a little bit more space to explore. I don't want to present this as some kind of safe utopia. Remember that this was still the United States in the midst of Jim Crow, white rampages north and south, and labor unrest. Harlem existed because of power vectors and hatred and fear. But one of the themes that I would like to stress in this class is the power of our very human relationships to influence history, at least a bit. It is not only the wealthy and powerful and angry who shape history. But back to the Harlem Renaissance. This was one of the few spaces, at least somewhat open to Black women, who were not conventionally cis and or het. Alain Locke was not the only one who ran a literary and arts salon. Alelia Walker, pictured on the slide, a businesswoman and arts patron, hosted special events at her apartment, known affectionately as the Dark Tower. Some events, like the one illustrated in the invite here on the slide, were more staid arts-related talks and lectures, but she also hosted parties where men and women could freely express their actual sexuality and gender. Langston Hughes dubbed Alelia Walker the joy goddess of the 20s. I think that precisely none of you will be surprised by the fact that work of women, especially queer Black women, gets written out of history or undervalued. The pages on the slide from the poetry collection Black Opals survived in Yale's library because they were annotated by Langston Hughes. But they also include the poem on the lower right by bisexual Black poet May Cowdery. My body is an ugly thing fashioned by God. My body is an empty thing made from crumbling sod. My soul is a lovely thing fashioned by God. My soul is a flaming thing that trampling hordes have left untrod. I could not find her full-length poetry collection, We Lift Our Voices, first published in 1936, at either Amazon or at Powell's. I believe that it is time for a reprint. Blues women were a power unto themselves, although this in no way means that their lives were protected or happy. You have Prove It On Me Blues by Gertrude Ma Rainey, recorded around 1928, in your pop culture package. Let's look over the lyrics here. Went out last night and had a great big fight. Everything seemed to go wrong. I looked up. To my surprise, the gal I was with was gone. Where she went, I don't know. I mean to follow everywhere she goes. Folks say I'm crooked. I didn't know where she took it. I want the whole world to know. They say I do it. Ain't nobody caught me. Sure got to prove it on me. Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must have been women, 'cause I don't like no men. It's true I wear a collar and tie. Makes the wind blow all the while. Don't you say I do it. Ain't nobody caught me. You sure got to prove it on me. Say I do it. Ain't nobody caught me. Sure got to prove it on me. I went out last night with a crowd of my friends. Must have been women, 'cause I don't like no men. Wear my clothes just like a fan. Talk to the gals just like any old man. 'Cause they say I do it. Ain't nobody caught me. Sure got to prove it on me. Rainey was singing about queer love on her own terms. In 1925, Rainey was arrested for hosting what was classed as a lesbian party at her home. The next day, Rainey was bailed out by Bessie Smith, another blues woman and Rainey's reputed lover. And you can see Bessie Smith on the slide here. 3 years later, Rainey wrote Prove It On Me Blues as a sort of mind your own business in response to speculation about her sexuality. By 1930, Smith, Rainey, and blues singer Lucille Bogan were known as the Big Three of the blues scene. You have Bogan's B.D. Woman's Blues, recorded in 1935, in your pop culture bundle for Package D as well. Before we read the lyrics, BD was short for bulldagger or bulldyke, a black slang term for butch lesbian, or in some cases, someone we might now identify as a trans man. While a slang term, BD was not an insult. Bulldagger was associated with physical strength, sexual prowess, emotional reserve, and butch chivalry. You can see that strength asserted in Bogan's lyrics. Come in a time, BD women, they ain't gonna need no man, 'cause the way they treat us is a low down and dirty sin. BD women, you sure can't understand. They got a head like a sweet angel and they walk just like a natural man. BD women, they all done learned their plan. They can lay their jive just like a natural man. BD women, you know they sure is rough. They all drink up plenty whiskey and they sure will strut their stuff. BD women, you know they work and make their dough, and when they get ready to spend it, they know they have to go. No discussion of the Harlem Renaissance and blues women would be complete without Gladys Bentley. You have 2 songs by Bentley in your popular culture bundle, but should know that the recordings only capture a little of Bentley's larger-than-life persona. Multi-talented, Bentley pushed the envelope of what was permitted, even in Harlem. They performed in top hat and tails, sometimes backed up, as one of the articles that you have notes, by a troupe of liberally painted male performers with effeminate voices and gestures. I encourage you to read the links on Bentley, and in particular the Smithsonian link that includes a clip with video footage. It captures something of the strength, energy, and genius of the Harlem Renaissance that I have given you the barest hint of here. Key points for Lecture 15 in Module D. The U.S. supplied Europe with war materiel, and that is spelled correctly. Materiel is military supplies and equipment, even before entering World War I and sending troops. The uptick in wartime production opened up better jobs to women and people of color. Black Americans moved in large numbers from the Jim Crow South to industrial cities of the North around World War I. This is known as the First Great Migration. White people in the North reacted with mob violence, which was particularly bad during the Red Summer of 1919. The 1920s is known for its roaring economy and changes in fashion, music, and dance, but it was also a time of extreme violence, the resurgence of the KKK, great income inequality, and anti-vice movements. Black innovations in the arts and literature reached worldwide acclaim between World War I and the Great Depression. Black scholars and poets of the Harlem Renaissance include Alain Locke, Zora Neale Hurston, and Langston Hughes. The Harlem of the 1920s also provided a place for people marginalized by sex and sexuality as well as race to be active creatively and socially. Alelia Walker and Alain Locke provided space for creatives who did not fit the cishet expectations of the day. Queer Black women, particularly major blues women, actively pushed the boundaries of acceptable gender and sexuality with their music and performances, finding ways to speak of their own realities. The coda of this lecture is on the fashion of the 1920s club scene. Black men generally wore suits of wool or linen like the ones shown in the image on the left here. Women in Harlem embraced the new styles of the 1920s for both day and evening wear. Colorful and glamorous clothing was an assertion of independence in an even greater sense than it was for white women of the period. Working and middle-class women in New York often made their own clothing, using the latest fashions to express themselves individually, like these young women in Harlem in 1925. Hemlines had already started to rise in the 1910s, as you saw in the Grizzly Bear video. The daytime fashions of the 1920s tended to be fairly conservative and often tailored. Evening clothing could be another thing entirely, where women and men wore costumes and dresses of their own creation. These images are all black and white, but evening clothing could come in all colors, shimmering with beads and sequins. The preferred boxy drape of dresses provided a canvas for creative treatment. The following images are pieces from museums that you can find in collections online. These two pieces are both from 1926. The one on the left is a high-end dress with silk and beads. The one on the right is made of net and plastic sequins. Both of these are in the Museum of the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. These pieces are actually from the early 1910s. It always bugs me when people think the fashions of the 1920s emerged without some precedent, and you could see the shape and decoration heading towards the 1920s here, including exposed ankles. These are in the Met in New York City, as are all of the remaining pieces. These are 1919 on the left and 1920 on the right. These are both around 1925. The remaining examples I will not talk through. They are all from the mid-1920s, and I've included close-up views so that you can see the embroidery and beadwork. You can stop watching whenever you get bored. Fini.